Hello, everyone. My name is Wendy Myers. Welcome to the Supercharged podcast. Today we have Niki Gratrix on the show, and she's going to be talking about emotional trauma and how that dramatically impacts our health and tips on releasing emotional trauma. She has so many good tips and some that may surprise you. This is a very, very compelling interview that I'm so excited to share with you. Niki Gratrix is an award-winning, internationally renowned registered nutritionist, mind-body expert, and health writer, helping people to optimize their energy. In 2005, she co-founded one of the largest mind-body clinics in integrative medicine in the UK with patients in 35 countries, where she worked as director of nutrition until 2010. The clinic specialized in treating chronic fatigue syndrome and won the award for outstanding practice in 2009, and later published a preliminary study in 2012 on its results with patients in the British medical journal Open. After finishing her degree in economic and international politics at the University of Warwick, Niki started her working career as a chartered accountant. After a 7-year career in financial services, she left to work in an environment with more heart and meaning and in ways she could more directly help and serve others. And we're very glad that she did. So we're going to be talking today about emotional trauma and how that affects your energy levels and your stress levels, and give the listeners some tips about using bioenergetics to address emotional trauma in such a profound way. I mean, for me, using bioenergetics has helped me improve my emotional life and release trauma in ways I didn't really expect. And as a result today, I'm so much happier and just so much clearer and more focused and just have more energy and just generally a happier person. So let's talk about, how important is stress and emotional trauma in maintaining abundant energy?
So it's such an important aspect. Emotional trauma, I believe, especially emotional trauma from childhood, is probably the most underexposed risk factor for probably all chronic complex illness today. And the poster child sort of adult illnesses related to emotional trauma are fatigue-related illnesses. So, for example, if you have a high level of trauma in childhood, you have a 6-fold increased risk of developing illnesses like chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia. And there are huge studies. I always talk about the Adverse Childhood Event Study, a study of over 17,500 adults done by the CDC and Kaiser Permanente, which showed that if you had very high levels of adverse childhood events, you have an increased risk of 7 out of the top 10 causes of death. And we're talking about, with trauma, we're talking about things like parents separating and divorce, physical, sexual or emotional abuse, physical or emotional neglect, things like domestic violence, substance abuse, mental illness in the family, or incarceration by a family member, for example. And in that big study, 67% of all adults have experienced at least one of those things that they found in the study. So, and that was also an underestimate. So they ignored things like asking about whether maybe you've experienced bullying, or maybe you had a traumatic birth, for example, or maybe there was financial trauma in childhood as well. And also we inherit trauma intergenerationally, and that's proven in the science as well. So you can look back at your own childhood and not necessarily have anything, but what about your parents or grandparents? So, like, for example, third-generation survivors of the Holocaust victims have the same physiological and psychological expression as their grandparents who were in the Holocaust. And that's found in all parts of the world where there's been war or famine. You'll see it go down 7 generations. So that's a huge factor. And also there's a huge amount of what we call silent trauma, which is where people are not always able to self-report. So in that big study that I mentioned, where they were looking at 17,500 adults, people asked about were you emotionally traumatized as a child? Well, if you were, how do you know? Because how do you know how your parents or caregivers were meant to behave? And especially emotional neglect, where the very essence of that is people are disconnected from their own emotions, so they wouldn't know that they'd been traumatized. And 50% of all adults have attachment trauma, which is another huge study as well. So that really, the bottom line is everybody's affected by adversity in childhood. that sets us up for how we're going to respond to the inevitable stresses in adulthood as well. So in childhood, if we have adversity, it affects our resilience to trauma for the rest of our lives. And we'll talk about that when we talk about mechanisms. But just a few other statistics as well. If you have high level of ACEs, you have triple the risk of heart disease and triple the risk of lung cancer and 3.5 times the risk of heart disease. If you have 6 adverse childhood events, ACEs as we call them, you have a reduced lifespan of 20 years. This is all from this huge CDC study. If you had just 4 ACEs, you have a 400% increase of developing depression in adulthood and Alzheimer's. You only have to have 2 ACEs to have a 100% increased risk of autoimmunity. And I just did an interview recently where I did a bit of research and found out you only need a couple of adverse childhood events and you have a 2-fold increased risk of having major depression during menopause. So it goes on and on. It's everything. It's mental health. It's, illnesses that are female dominant illnesses. It's cancer. It's heart disease. It's everything. So the bottom line is just saying, there is an emotional component to every ailment and illness. And so, all of us practitioners need to be addressing that. And anybody who has, who wants either to be supercharged or especially if you have fatigue, you have this 6-fold increased risk of developing fatigue in adulthood with emotional trauma in childhood. So it's the most underexposed risk factor. I'd say it's probably more important than toxins. Yeah. But they usually go together. So one of the things I should just say, it's not true to say that smoking causes lung cancer. It's a contributing factor because there are people who smoke all the time and don't get lung cancer, right? So it's a huge contributing factor, and that's how to consider, adversity and unresolved trauma and emotional trauma. It's one of these huge contributing factors, but you normally need some toxins thrown in. And what's happening is, and we'll talk about mechanisms about what trauma does to the body, but it reduces your ability to detox, it suppresses your immunity, it does all these things that then set you up for reacting with illness to the trigger in adulthood. That could be a microbial trigger, it could be another emotional trigger, or it could be a toxic trigger, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so let's talk about those mechanisms. How does trauma and stress affect our biology? Yeah, so how does childhood autobiography become adult biology? These huge studies by the CDC and Kaiser Permanente triggered some major research, and one of the things that they found is essentially it's all to do with this HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and it's about the stress response. It's this fight-flight response that we have to stresses in the environment. And what happens when we have either a one-off shock or we have this intermittent but chronic stress, like being around an unpredictable parent constantly, what happens is that they're actually calling it kindles the brain, which means it triggers the brain to get stuck in a chronic stress response, even if the external stress is taken away. So we have a reduced threshold of what triggers a stress response in us in response to a stress, and the whole system's reset. So we are more responsive to stress, and we have a higher stress response for longer since the day the trauma happened. And so essentially one researcher said that, or one science writer said, it's like the child is marinating in inflammatory cytokines all the way through since that time there was a reset, because we know when the HPA axis gets triggered into a chronic stress response, all these biological changes take place, which eventually lead to increased inflammation. And of course, inflammation obviously correlated with so many chronic complex illnesses. So, when we talk about an illness like autoimmunity being triggered, well, actually it may have started 20 years earlier when this system reset happened. And we know, one of the most robust findings in the science of psychoneuroimmunology, with the huge papers that looking at this mind-body HPA axis connection, is that negative emotions, trauma, and so on suppresses immunity. That's one of the basic understandings of psychoneuroimmunology. So
We've got suppressed immunity, we've got being stuck in the chronic stress response, increased inflammatory cytokines. It changes our gut. So when we have trauma in childhood, studies have been done where they took, with mammals, they would separate the mother and the baby, recreating attachment trauma. It changes the intestinal permeability. It changes the gut colonization. When you're stuck in chronic stress, it reduces your digestive enzymes, so you're not digesting properly. In essence, when this system reset happens, you are less in the state of the parasympathetic rest, digest, detoxify. You're in the stress, fight, flight response, so all of that rest, digest, detoxify aspect gets downregulated. So you've got worse sleep, you're not detoxifying, and you're not digesting properly, and that's the foundation of illness, right?
That sounded like me before I started Nest last year. About a year ago.
Yes, so it's the major impact, and so that's one way it actually is working to change the biochemistry. But trauma also affects our behavior, so it's worth mentioning that these big studies, the Kaiser Permanente CDC study, actually started in an obesity clinic, and they found out they had this obesity clinic in Kaiser Permanente, and it was for people who were quite seriously obese, and they were on this program of weight loss, and they were doing really well, but then they would have a 55% dropout rate. And the researchers were like, why is that? Why are people doing really well, and when they start losing the weight, they get to a certain plateau and then they would drop out? And so they found out by mistake that a lot of the people in the study were reporting they'd been abused in childhood, and it was odd, and the researchers weren't expecting it. And one woman summed it up when she said, being overweight was a protection mechanism against unwanted male attention. Now, that is a case where you've got a protocol which is a healthy thing, a healthy dietary protocol to lose weight, is a threat to her survival and her existence because she has unresolved abuse in childhood. And you see that a lot with fatigue and people with chronic stress and chronic fatigue syndrome. So they have a different type of expression of their trauma where, for example, if they have attachment trauma, they may have learned to get love and be okay by being an achiever type or being an overgiver where they constantly discount their own needs, or a perfectionist type. So they were kind of frightened into this, achieving or whatever it may be. And so they're earning love instead of being a human being and knowing that you're already deserving. And that it can be a real threat to their identity they don't really know how to slow down and stop. They've forgotten how to do it because they were never, trained how to do that, and it was downplayed and it wasn't important. They never got their needs met. So when you start saying you need to relax, it kind of is a threat to actually their identity. It's the same way as telling somebody you need to lose weight, and actually it becomes a threat to them. So just to give you an idea, so it affects behavior in that way where it's basically sabotaging behaviors. So we could have great protocol advice about what to do, but we don't stick to it because we keep sabotaging it because actually we don't feel safe doing it. And also beliefs. Trauma will affect beliefs unconsciously. We all know that the placebo effect and positive thinking has such an impact on biology. It changes our biology. With 33% of the effectiveness of all drugs are now placebo, right? So we know it has a physiological change. When you have a strong positive belief that something is going to happen, you're going to get better, that changes your biology. With emotional trauma, it's often unconscious. It's feelings and beliefs that we're disconnected from, we may not be aware of, things to do with, for example, feeling shame or not feeling that we deserve health, for example. So that's where the power of the mind will actually sabotage as well. So those are some of the ways that it translates into an expression of illness. So it's biochemistry, it's behavior, and it affects our beliefs as well.
Yeah, so let's talk about the steps to addressing emotional trauma. Where do people start? I mean, I've had about probably 10 years over the course of my life of talk therapy. Not because I'm crazy, but because I really love self-help stuff. Like a lot of women do, a lot of the female listeners. I love the feeling like I'm taking care of myself emotionally. And one of the ways I did that was starting as a teen, going to therapy and talking it out. But the problem with that, I think that a lot of what drives us emotionally, we're not consciously aware of. And that is kind of part of the problem with talk therapy is, and it's great. I mean, a lot of people need that. They need that connection, especially a lot of people that are socially isolated today, and people do sort out their problems that way. But I think that for me, I'd kind of been there, done that, and I still felt I had all this emotional baggage that I wasn't able to address because it was unconscious. And that's where, for me, bioenergetics came in, doing a program called Nest Health, in addressing, identifying and addressing those unconscious traumas that are drivers of behavior.
Yeah, you've made a really good point. So, it's very interesting when we look at what is an emotion, and when we, is an emotion, is it purely our emotions driven purely by neurotransmitters? Are emotions just expressions of hormonal balance in our body? So are sort of emotions just biochemical? And we've got all this research coming through now about the gut and how that affects how we feel, right? So when we have dysbiosis, we have this increased risk of anxiety and depression, and they're even looking at probiotics to help people with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. So we know that this, emotions have this physical component, but emotions are also energy. And, that's why one of the most interesting areas, like you, I'm a big fan of bioenergetics, because I can address the emotional and the physical health by using bioenergetics. What's bioenergetics? The study of energy in living systems. So, it's fascinating when you consider emotion as a kind of, it's a thing, it's electromagnetic, it has charge, as well as having this kind of physical component. So I often say, there's now this infamous video of Cyril Bork with the My Health device, a pulsed electromagnetic frequency device. He's holding it, about 5 or 6 inches away from a 5,000-pound bull, and he's sending out a magnetic wave, and the bull is immediately calmed down. So that's a direct proof. You can go and look that video up online, or we can give it out as a link, right? Showing that, emotions aren't just biochemical, they're also electromagnetic. And I think that's where there are some amazing things, other proof that, emotions are sort of energetic as well. So you look at some of the most successful interventions for trauma, they're on the energy side, so energy psychology, things like neurofeedback, which is changing brain waves in response to feedback, EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. There's no talking involved with that. That's changing waves again. EFT, emotional freedom technique, that's actually tapping on the ends of acupuncture points on the face. So what we see is some of the most effective treatments are working at the energetic level. And what's the most interesting, especially when we start to talk about working with things like NES, infoceuticals, and as I mentioned, the PEMP device, you can work energetically with people, purely energetically, where you don't sort of do any talk therapy, or even start kind of, you let go of the story. And with using energy, you can just create an emotional release. You can move stuck emotions by just pure energetic work, because emotions are frequency. So you could use sound therapy, you can use light therapy, you can use pulsed electromagnetic frequency like the PEMP device, and you can use electromagnetic and even currents, like electromagnetic currents will work. There's another great video people could go and look up online. If you just look up trauma bear on Google, in YouTube, there's a video on there that Dr. Peter Levine, who's the brilliant expert in somatic experiencing, it's another form of trauma release, and he shows how in an animal, it's a video of a polar bear actually going through trauma because he's being chased by some people who are going to shoot him to actually shoot him with just a tranquilizer, and they're going to cure him. They're vets. But after the bear slowly starts to wake up, you'll see his entire body is shaking. And that was the trauma release. It's an electrical charge release. So it's a nervous electromagnetic frequency release. And what happens when we have a trauma, what's happening with most people in trauma is that electrical release doesn't happen. Instead, we go into a freeze response. And when we're in freeze, it sort of fixes and ties up the whole nervous system. The body's in a tense state, and we start to get pain. We start to get chronic pain, for example. And also when we're stuck with frozen trauma, that is just the body's gone stiff and it's holding itself, and there's trapped emotional stuff, and the nervous system is stuck in this fight-flight response, that takes tremendous energy away from life and living. So that's why when you see with chronic fatigue people, there's this, if there's a lot of frozen trauma going on, that's tremendously depleting to be holding all this trauma on and all that muscle tension and the nervous system chronically stuck. And actually you can see in adults, there's certain practitioners you'll see when they start working and releasing emotional trauma, you actually see the body releasing and shaking, and it's the entire nervous system letting go of that electrical charge. So emotions have charge, they have frequency. So, you know, and that's one of the reasons why, for example, I mentioned you could use sound, you could use light, you can use magnetics. You can also use frequency imprinted on water, which is what we use in NES when we have, like I'm just holding up here, like this is an infoceutical. So we know that we can, it's possible, if we know emotions have frequency, we can find out what frequency they are and we can imprint it on water. So 30 years of heart math have shown that, for example, they can look at a heart rate variability result for you, and they have a 75% chance that they'll be able to tell you what emotional state you're in just by looking at your heart rate variability, for example. So we know this, you know, now the work of Peter Fraser, where he's actually decoded certain emotions and we can print it on water. And the beauty is, this is a gentle way, when you work with pure energy, of releasing energy without re-traumatizing the person. It's just a release of feeling. Now, one of the things we need to do with emotional stuff, emotional trauma, is it does need to be felt to be released, but it doesn't have, we don't have to attach a story, we don't have to make a drama, we don't have to cajole it, we don't have to negotiate with it. When we work energetically, and this is what I do all the time with my clients when I'm working, you know, with infoceutics or a PEMP device, they often will suddenly one day, I have to coach them, so they need to be prepared, where they might suddenly feel very sad for a day, and they don't really know why. It's just come up for no reason, and I sort of coach them around that and say, you know what, there's nothing to do about this. You know, emotion is just energy. It's just an energy release. There's no meaning, there's no anything else to talk about it. So it's a very interesting way to work, and it's a very gentle, non-traumatizing way to support people when you purely work on sort of the frequency level, and you're actually bypassing the mind completely, which can be, you know, it's sometimes we do, like you said, we need the talk therapy. Sometimes that is needed and it's appropriate, but you know, people should know you can also work purely energetically, and just you can be releasing, you know, out of the body and sort of having an emotional detox. I call it the emotional detox. So yeah, I love bioenergetics for that reason. It's why I work with NES and why I use the infoceuticals and the PEMP device and so on with my clients.
Yeah, so let's go into that a little bit deeper. So why don't you tell people a little bit about what is NES Health? And how does a NES Health scan, like you do a little scan, you kind of get at home, you would, you know, order one of these little scanners, you do a scan, and you see a lot of information in your scan, which you then review with a practitioner. Tell us a little bit about what you see in regards to our emotions in that scan.
So there's a tremendous amount that you can see going on emotionally in an energy scan. So because both emotions and the physical body are energy, everything's energy, you'll be able to see all the energetic aspects of organs and systems and so on in the scan, but there's also the mind screens. So the mind screens in the NES scan will literally pick up trauma that has registered on the brain and is connected to different parts of the body. So which is the brain hologram screen. For people may not know, but that's actually based on the work of German New Medicine and Dr. Hamer's work, where he was a doctor, originally a doctor who his son was actually murdered, and within a few weeks he developed cancer, and he realized that the trauma of what happened with his son was directly correlated with his cancer. And then he did huge amounts of research correlating what he could see were different parts of the brain being impacted by trauma on the energetic level, which would then correlate to different parts of the body. And he did thousands of scans, and Peter Fraser, who created the NES system, actually incorporated all of that work into the scan. So, you know, it's kind of reiterating what I mentioned, that, you know, trauma is energetic as well as having a physical aspect. So what's brilliant about the scan is we can, it's possible to read the frequency and be able to detect and pick that up. So it's definitely going to pick up things that you as a client may not have been aware of at all. And I've had cases where, you know, we might see something in that brain hologram scan come up for somebody, and they just don't really know what it means at the time, but it's flagged. And it's I had one client where she kept on getting like terror coming up, and she couldn't really work out what was going on. And because that came up in the scan, she started to investigate. And this is what a lot of us don't do, is we don't talk sometimes to our own parents and our grandparents about not only their experiences, but also what we may have gone through as in early childhood. And this particular client said, she asked her mother, like, was there anything that happened to me in early childhood where I would have had terror? And then she was already in her 30s asking this, and her mother said to her, never told her before, but said, oh yeah, I remember very early on she'd actually got some kind of bug or virus. She'd only just been born, and they placed her in an isolation unit for about 3 weeks. And when mum came back, the baby was non-responsive to when her mother came back. So it was real attachment trauma. It would have been terrorizing for a little baby that young. And she only developed one kidney after that, which is interesting because in Chinese medicine we have this strong correlation of fear with the kidneys. So that was very interesting as well.
And isolation with the kidneys.
Yes. So this is a sort of thing that we see that gets picked up by the scan. And it's part of, sometimes people will know when they see something in the scan, and it's like showing up a particular sort of a generic statement, and then the person needs to look at that and go, they either know what it is right away, or they might not know what it is yet. Sometimes people won't know what it is, but they just need to do the protocol because it's going to clear through anyway. And they might just, it might be something that actually is not of that great importance. It may have been somebody said a negative thing or did a negative thing when we were 5 or 6 years old, actually traumatized us at that age, but it wasn't an important incident in itself. But we can clear it through anyway because we can work with the frequency directly, and the person might just have often get clients with having vivid dreams, for example, and that's part of the processing of clearing through. Or they might have a day where they just feel sad for a few days and that passes. And I just always say this shall pass too. You don't need to do anything about this. Just feel it, breathe, and release. So just feeling, breathing, take some extra time out when people are having emotional releases. And know that there's nothing to do about it. That's the point. So we'll often, and some other people will get memories coming back too, not always, but sometimes people have, insight into something or a memory. Other times, I've been through a process of going through I had a lot of spleen work to do, which is linked with kind of the worry mental.
I had that too.
Work.
I had spleen keep coming up.
I was like all night, just angst all night. And it's funny because you'll just forget. And then I was like the next day, I suddenly realized, I'd been taking spleen. So it was the pharmaceutical on the spleen. So, and that's often what you'll see. What's amazing with clients and with Ness is you'll see someone, for example, will talk about recovering from their IBS, but they'll talk about how they felt different as a person. And that's the key thing. I know when somebody's gone through real healing, when they're actually saying, I don't feel like the same person I was before. They're talking about their feelings. I don't feel as wound up. I don't feel as angry. I feel calmer. I feel more confident. And they'll always be saying that. And then they'll talk about their physical symptoms disappearing as well. So, it's a beautiful way to kind of work when you're working that way, and it's gentle as well. So we're not going to suddenly send some people into a huge kind of re-trauma or anything like that. It feels very safe.
Yeah, I think some people can maybe worry about that with Ness, but with any kind of real healing and real progress on your emotions, you do have to kind of confront maybe some unpleasant emotions. But I found personally, and processing a lot of emotions happens when you're dreaming. And that was very profound for me after I did the Nest Health Practitioner training. Then I realized that I started having really vivid dreams as soon as I started on my own Nest Health program, because you're just processing all the stuff. That's what dreams are for, processing your emotions, filing them away in various parts of your brain. And so that's, a good side effect, I think, of Nest. I like dreaming and having vivid dreams. So luckily a lot of this stuff happens while you're dreaming.
No, I was going to say, like, if you've got a big fear of something and then you have the dream about that happening, much better to have that manifest in the dream state than actually magnetize it in your life. Because that is the other thing about emotions. They are magnetic, they have charge, and they impact what we're bringing into our lives or not. So, yeah, I totally agree. If you can process something energetically without having to sometimes manifest it physically, because that's what's actually happening. I often talk about this a lot with my clients as well when we're talking about, clearing out emotions. You could sometimes, when something, happens to us and it comes into our life and it triggers, like somebody leaves us, and what we have is a huge emotional release. Well, the reason it happened is we needed to release that emotion because it was blocking us, right? So we'll bring in events and things, especially when people start to clear their emotions. We can bring in things that will, if you have a fear of something, it might manifest because you release the fear. I'd much rather do it in my dream sleep, though.
Yeah, exactly. But for me, I'm like, bring it on. I don't want to stay stuck where I am. I don't want to continue to go through this ruminating negative thoughts. That was a big problem I had in the past. These constant ruminating thoughts that just circle around and around like this broken record. And I don't want to be in that state. I want to move forward. And so to deal with a few negative emotions on a very temporary basis that then pass, I'll take that any day rather than staying stuck where I am.
I couldn't agree more. And it's good for people. It's good. We need to get the word out there about emotional detox, because it's in that way, it's kind of a little similar to physical detox, right? So we know, it's worth it to go through a little bit of a healing crisis on the physical side because it's temporary, because we can also manage it and we can reduce it down by cycling things like supplements, whatever it is that we're taking. But also, the same with emotions. We have this need, I think, in the West to sort of just have a totally linear, like, I take this or I do this and I immediately get better. It's like, well, it doesn't quite work like that. It often does require, a connecting into maybe feeling some stuff that was repressed or that we disassociated from because it was too painful at the time. But when you're doing it in this safe environment, when you know what to expect and you're working with a good practitioner, you can just have that emotion come up and it not devastate you. And you realize you can be telling yourself, this is just a feeling and it's energy and nothing else, and energy moves. And the only way I'll block it is if I try and run away from it. I go into my head about it. It's one of the biggest things, that it's a real trap. This is one of my pitfalls of emotional detox. So a big emotion comes up and then we turn it mental and we turn it into a big story and then we go and do something about it. It's like, no, you've missed it. It's no need to do that. Just let the emotions come up and release, and just take time. And that's almost like a kind of emotional meditation. You're feeling it and allowing it to flow through, and actually you're just accepting it, breathing and letting it flow through, accepting, breathing, letting it flow through. And that's all that's needed. And I think that sometimes in our doingness society, we kind of forget, we don't really know how to do that. Nobody's really given us the manual, but that is actually how you would help support emotional release. Is just a lot of breathing helps, and the usual things, Epsom salts baths and lots of water, the same way you would with physical as well.
Yes.
Some good tips for people.
I suffered from depression through most of my 20s and really learned a lot of different techniques to deal with that. And one of them was to not get depressed about being depressed. But more about thinking about letting that emotion kind of roll over you like a wave, and then it passes. And that was always just really helpful for me, is to recognize that I'm not a depressed person. This is not who I am. It's more just a temporary emotion. And
if people got that, it's not only depression. There's the other thing we do is, for example, when we realize, here's another example, a bit more on the mental side, but like we might realize we're being judgmental of ourselves. So when we notice being judgmental of ourselves, we get judgmental about the fact we're judgmental. So we'll do the very thing we're trying to stop. And it's the same with fear. And then you get afraid because you're feeling fear. That's leading to a panic attack. So yes, it's very important to be able to learn to keep that slight centeredness through the feeling coming up, because otherwise we just spiral it and we make it bigger. So it's a really good tip. It's a really, really good tip. People get judgmental about being judgmental. People can feel shame. That's another one. One of the worst feelings is probably when you connect with shame, because it's it's a kind of self-loathing of yourself. Guilt is sort of feeling bad about something you did. Shame is I am bad, different from something I did. So it's probably the lowest emotion. And then when we feel that, we realize we have that, it's usually semi-conscious, but it's around in a lot of us who have a kind of self-love deficit disorder. 50% of adults have attachment trauma from childhood. So that's the self-love deficit disorder is part of that. But then we can feel ashamed about the fact we feel shame. So there's a cut-off point we need to, if we can get that, oh, okay, this is just passing through me. This is just a feeling. It's just energy, and it's not who the totality of who I am. It's a real healing when somebody can get to that stage, and that's where a lot of calm meditation and breathing and daily exercises of kind of meditation and breathing exercises to keep that centeredness through stormy emotions is a good thing. And by the way, I would say another tip as well. If you are, sometimes when we do breathing, and we might be taking something like pharmaceuticals as well to bring things up, sometimes it can get too intense. The feeling is overwhelming. If you're breathing into it and you're wanting it to release, you're accepting, breathing, releasing, and then it's actually getting too much and it's not dissipating, I actually tell people go and do something else. So actually get up, go and distract yourself, do something else, because it's still processing even while you're doing other things. And then what you'll find is you can come back to it. And once you go quiet and you start breathing and you do centered breathing again, you'll feel it come back. But each time it'll be less intense because it's clearing through. So these are more tips with just how to deal with emotions when they're coming up as well.
And I think another really important point of our talk is you want to clear negative emotions and traumas because they can cause physical health issues and they can promote physical health issues. And for a lot of people don't understand that when you're going to a medical doctor or even a functional medicine practitioner, they're working biochemically. Doctors are working with drugs and surgery. The functional medicine practitioners it's an upgrade, but working with supplements, still trying to elicit a biochemical response, physical change in the body. And that the kind of missing the point or missing a large aspect of how our body works is we have an energetic field that we need to address energetically, and you can't get that with a conventional medical or functional practitioner. And if you don't address emotional traumas, it can affect your physical health. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean that's the huge point. And you can go so far. You can go to some degree, like we mentioned. If somebody does have dysbiosis, you could play around with neurotransmitters and balance neurotransmitters. You could work on a metabolic level, and for some that will balance their emotional state, and that's what they need to do. For many people it doesn't go far enough, and especially when you get this nervous system reset. So remember when I mentioned, trapped emotions is a blockage and a disturbance and a distortion to the energy field, and the energetic aspects of the body is what is the blueprint for the physical body. So what's happening in the field is telling the biology what to do. So if that's got distorted information, this is this idea where if you've got distorted information in your energy field, you will constantly, for example, you might need to keep taking tons of vitamins and minerals because you're not actually absorbing and utilizing them properly, because there's a distortion say in the stomach field that's happening at the energetic level. And one of the places where shame and guilt gets stored in truckloads is in the stomach and in the digestive area. So it's a distortion in the energy field, and the energy field is telling the biology what to do. It's the blueprint. So just turning this back, when the Human Genome Project was done, they only found that humans had about 20,000 genes, which is a big shock because we have like 2 million different proteins in the body, right? And everybody thought we'd have one gene for one protein. It's like, where's the missing link? And the missing link is, it looks like, how do genes aren't the only information that tells proteins how to specialize and how to become liver cells and kidney cells and how to repair. There's this strong electromagnetic field around that is telling the proteins how to differentiate and regenerate. So when we have a distortion in the energy field, one of the biggest distortions in the field are chronic, stuck, negative emotions and low emotions. And Chinese medicine has known that for thousands of years, right? It's probably one of the oldest mind-body systems. So it's vital to clear the energetic level to allow the biology to repair itself, because it's like that's the information that, the building block might be nutrition, good diet, the supplements. That's the raw materials to rebuild, but you need the information for the raw materials to tell them how to do that. And you need to go and become a liver cell, you need to be a skin cell, you need to go and rebuild and repair the digestion. It's kind of the foreman. And if the foreman will get distorted, if the foreman's got distorted information, that is going to, nothing you will do on the biochemistry will work as effectively. And I remember there's a brilliant energetic practitioner, Dr. Dietrich Klinghardt, right, who, he has this brilliant sort of axiom that, for an equal amount of unresolved, what he says, for an equal amount of bacterial microbial infection, there's an equal amount of stored toxicity, and for an equal amount of stored toxicity, there's an equal amount of unresolved emotional trauma. And he was saying that in 1984. Wow. And he often says, you've got to, you can't just do one without addressing all of these, because they're all interconnected. And you'll often find sometimes you may only get so far with a biochemical detox. You get so far, you get stuck, nothing else is coming out. Time to do some energy work, time to do the psycho-emotional, try and do some energy clearing work, and then you'll find the biochemistry starts to work better again. And this is what I discovered with all my clients, is that I needed this multifactorial approach. We don't just throw out the biochemistry at all, it's still important, but the energetic is hugely important, and we've got these tools that enable us to correct at that level, which is superb. Bioenergetics can get to places that nutrition can't.
I felt like, for me, and like probably a lot of listeners, I had reached a point in my life where I was eating a spectacular diet, I was taking the highest quality supplements, I had been detoxing for 5 years. I was exercising, meditating. I was doing all these things to take care of myself. And I still just didn't feel like I was operating at the level in my health and emotional life that I should have been. And I was kind of concerned that I had all this emotional stuff going on that I didn't really know how to address. And Ness Health gave me that answer. And it kind of came at a time that I needed it the most. Like, when you ask the question, the answers will come. And so I'm really, really thankful to Ness Health and the CEO, Harry Massey of Ness Health, for, providing this just incredible tool to help people. Because I know a lot of people listening feel like they're doing so much for their health, and they just feel like they want to go to that next level. And I really think that Ness Health provides, that answer.
Yeah, it's superb. And one of the other brilliant things about the system specifically is that you can work remotely as well. And a lot of the systems that, especially energy testing systems and so on, like kinesiology and so on, some of the most advanced forms of that you need to be in person with people, and often you need two practitioners, so it's very intense work. And I could have sort of, I did all of Klinghardt's training. Actually, I still think he's superb, but I didn't take on his system. I wanted to do Ness, because that allowed me to be able to have clients all over the world and to be able to get this energetic scanning and the treatments out there, no matter where people are. And a lot of my clients are fatigued, so they can't get out of the house, some of them. So all they need, we post everything to them. As long as they can get online and are fairly okay on a computer, they've got access to superb healing technology. So yeah, I love the system, and it's great.
Yeah, and I love that it's designed like that to help people in their own home, because like you said, there's so many people they don't have access to care in their area. If they're in Egypt, or they're in rural Montana, or where what have you, there's access to quality health care for anyone in the world using Ness.
Yes. Yes.
So do you have any final tips to offer the listeners in regards to emotional trauma and addressing that?
I would only say that trust that the body knows how to heal itself, and quite often all we need to do is set up the right support network, give the right information to the body, have the building blocks like good nutrition available, the body will do the rest. So we need to do our part. You know, the body's still a mystery ultimately, and science doesn't really understand. We haven't even talked about the aspects of quantum physics here, and there's huge implications of all that too. But the beauty is we don't need to understand it for the healing to take place, and that the body does know. You know, when we break a leg, we go to hospital, you know, all the doctors do is set it. They just stick the bones together. They don't do anything to make the bones heal. The body does that, right? So what we're doing is we're creating an optimum environment. We're providing the nutrients, we're providing the information necessary that's us doing our part. So it's a co-creative process with the body. And it's a balance to not over-controlling and knowing when to just step back and go, you know, trusting my body knows how to heal itself. And when I send the right, you know, our own engagement as just in our own psychology as well, the individuals are great tools, but ultimately the engagement of you as the person, setting a clear intention for what you want as your outcome, fully engaging with that in an optimistic, committed attitude and a belief that it will work is tremendous, probably 50% of the of the story, right? So that's the other thing I would say, that the trust is needed, and that commitment and the knowingness that it's possible, that recovery is possible, that supercharged energy is possible.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, because when you go to a conventional doctor or psychiatrist, you know, you're really only going to be offered medications for any kind of emotional issues you're going through, depression or anxiety. And for me, you know, I've been on antidepressants before, and they're a Band-Aid. You know, they're really just covering up symptoms and not addressing the underlying root cause. And for me, I'm done with Band-Aids. I want to address the underlying root cause to get rid of the depression, get rid of anxiety or any kind of other negative thoughts or ruminating thoughts or, you know, physical reactions in my body because of these emotional trauma issues, and just to release them and let go of them so they're no longer an issue. And I think so many people get stuck in that cycle. They're just not aware that there are so many unbelievable cutting edge modalities out there that really are light years ahead of what the medical mainstream community are doing.
Yeah, it's so true. And you mentioned antidepressants. It almost works against what we need to do to release trauma, because it'll stop the down emotion because it numbs you out, but it also stops you from feeling, you know, the joy. You can't access the joy when you're essentially being numbed out by something which is the Band-Aid approach. That's not to say, you know, sometimes it's highly appropriate for people to be on that medication, and definitely don't just come off it. If you're listening and you're on it, make sure you go and see your medical doctor before making any changes if you are on a prescribed antidepressant. This is, you know, the safety point there. But yeah, ultimately dealing with the root cause, it would require a gradual reduction of that medication, because part of releasing trauma, it's learning to, do you know what it is? It's actually learning to feel again. It's a form of awakening. It's when we release trauma, we need to feel again.
People don't like that though.
I know, because it hurts. Yeah. They come out, they live in their head. There's somebody who's living in their head, and they just have a body there to take their head to different rooms, you know, and they live here because it's too painful. It's been too painful further down, and too painful to be in the physical body, too painful to be in, you know, in their female organs, you know, and have that consciousness and feeling in there because of trauma from the past. And it's one of, you know, learning to be a sensual being is learning to be human and learning to enjoy life, and the reason we're here is to feel again. So that's the other thing. I was just talking to a client who was actually asking me, would this work we're doing with this actually help with, you know, sex life as well? And I said, well, this is part of the learning to feel again, is part of this awakening and connecting. And we've all got so much baggage, and we think about what we've put in our bodies physically and the stuff that we over, you know, decades that we've built up toxin wise. Just think about all the unresolved emotional stuff, because who's really doing a lot of that work, you know? And so you're bound to, especially say you've had a really busy time where you've been externally focused. And I've always find this, you know, when you might find the same, but I've found this when I've had a very external busy work doingness time, it's painful coming back into this, like, oh, there's that emotion I didn't process. No, there's this horrible feeling. And I remember I had many years of working intensively hard, actually running a clinic with the chronic fatigue clinic. And when I finally stopped and took a break, I was actually numb for about 6 months. I was doing 2 hours of breathing a day, and all I could feel was numb. And I'd had a 12-year career in accounting and finance and banking before that, and hadn't really connected into that either. So we were talking about, wow, 20 years of unconnected baggage. And I can tell you, to start with, I didn't even feel anything. It was numbness. And so there's stages, and then I kept going with it 2 hours a day. I did it through a lot of breathing work and sensing and feeling and connecting. And stuff comes up when you do that. And I would start to feel into different parts of my body, and and memories would come up. And then I'd be connecting to things from the past because I was breathing into the kidney area, and then I'd breathe into the stomach area. And so part of clearing emotional trauma is it's an awakening process, an awakening to feeling. It's not a thinking thing, it's a feeling thing. And we live in very disconnected times. And this is really, we're getting to this is my core message really. To me, it's about bringing the heart back into healthcare, because this the disconnection from that feeling state means we lose our inner compass. It means we don't listen to messages from the body because they're not being listened to. It means that we push through things like the number of clients that I've had, dealing with chronic fatigue, who they were totally disconnected from what their body was telling them. Time to relax, time to slow down, time to breathe, time to connect. But if you're no feeling in the body because you're constantly disconnected, you don't know how to pace, you don't know when to switch off, you don't know how to relax. So this connection to feeling and being guided by feelings, both intuitively feeling in terms of what we do in our lives, whether we take on projects, is it a time to relax, calm down, spend quiet time connecting with our body, or is it an external busy time? It's like understanding the seasons of life, and you can't have summer all year round. Actually, maybe there are some places on earth where you can, but most of us, there's places where it's winter all around, but not the best idea. But you know what I'm saying? Like there's natural cycles in the body. Winter is more of a time where we can take more time connecting with ourselves. So this is probably, I'm glad we've sort of come to this point, because it's my core raison d'etre in what I do, is to have people start connecting back to the feeling state, because the feelings, if that's not happening, that's you're on your direction down towards illness if you're not connected to it. But also we need a more heart-guided, heart-centered life. And when we slow down, funnily enough, things speed up, especially, when you connect to the heart, you end up magnetizing things to you. You're letting things come to you rather than chronically doing. We're all exhausted doing that. So that's part of my mission, is training people in their general lives how to stay connected to the heart. And yes, that does mean slowing down. It means like taking 20 minutes, maybe twice a day, to do like nothing. And people don't know how to do that. So
I don't have time for that. I don't have 20 minutes twice a day. I'm joking.
Okay. I do know. I almost took you serious there, because I do have clients who tell me that. I've got clients now telling me that, and I hate to say it, but I almost I don't say to those people all the time, it's not always right, but I can say it here more in a more general sense, that person isn't sick enough yet to start doing 20 minutes of calming.
Your body is going to force you to stop at some point.
Yes. And, this is the other message I'm thinking of, these people who I'm working with at the moment who've got this as well. When you slow down and you connect with heart, and you feel and you start to get centered, it changes what you're doing. So you have this insight, you're like, I'm wasting my time on that project. That's the person who's causing me problem. I get rid of them, and my life gets easier. When you stay connected to heart, you're staying connected to your emotional sense of self. You start to get insights about what will actually make life easier, and things would flow, and then you're in the flow better. But most of us aren't doing that. We're in this frenetic mental state all the time. So clearing emotional trauma it's an extraordinary awakening experience. It totally changed my life when I had literally a spiritual kind of an emotional awakening. And I could never live my life the way that I did when I was in my 20s as a finance and banking person, being totally oblivious. So when we slow down, we notice things, we allow things to come to us rather than chasing all the time. And how cool would that be? Because think about how exhausted we all are when we're not connected to our feelings. Our feelings are a source of information about the world around us. And when you're not connected to that, you miss signals, you miss easy paths, you miss seeing the danger signs of something coming your way that's going to cause problems. You get disconnected from all that. So life gets harder when you're not in your heart. And also it just becomes generally depressing and sad when you're not connected to heart, because, you know, you've had to step out of that because it was too painful. But that reconnection, you know, it's a reconnection back into joy and engaging with life again. So I have a lot of clients that have disengaged with life and they've become fatigued because they got burnt, they got bad things happened, you know, and so on. And then they just contracted, their systems contracted, and they needed to go to shut off, basically. And what we do when I work with those types of people is we're gradually getting the heart to open again in a gradual, safe space. And we also show people how to do that safely, to re-engage with life and open up again and to start to feel again. Because as humans, we're meant to be sensual beings, and we've become mental beings. Yeah. And I think that is probably at its core, the mental is, we're overly masculine and mental, and the feminine energy, which is a feeling, sensing state, has been disconnected. And if I would say if there's one thing about chronic fatigue, it's that female-male imbalance on an energetic level. It's too much externalized mental doingness and this disconnect from the more invisible energetic feeling sense in the body. So that's how you could describe the entire illness, as that. So that's part of what I do in my coaching and in my training courses and in my programs and things, is also training people how to kind of get back into their feminine. We need the feminine energy back, don't we? Don't we need?
Yes, we do. Yes, we do.
The feminine. We need females. We need the women. We need what the essence of feminine needs to come back into healthcare and life in general. So that's, yeah, it was great to connect with you on that, because that's probably my number one mission.
Well, tell the listeners more about where they can find you and learn more about, you know, what it is that you do and the services that you offer.
Yeah, so people can check out my website, which is nikigratrix.com, nikigratrix.com. I have a free ebook on there you can download on the 7 steps to healing emotional trauma. I know you can get it totally free. And once you sign up to that, you can kind of stay engaged with what I'm doing, because I talk about this on a lot of different summits. Got one coming up soon on immune health and so on. I'm always doing work like that. But also I do programs like 3 and 6 month programs where you can work one-to-one with me, where we do nest scanning. I also do questionnaire analysis, and we work with a range. I work with a range of things, so pharmaceuticals, nutraceuticals, essential oils, all personalized, and then sort of coaching on the psychology side as well to keep people on track. So, and I've got some big announcements coming up soon as well, so stay in touch. So I've got some programs, some other types of things that I'm launching.
Exciting.
Yeah, to help people to create a community, a community going forward and everything. So check out my website, and, you know, I bring stuff out all the time. So,
well, Niki, thank you so much for coming on the show. I mean, you're such a wealth of information. I've talked to you several times, and we're friends, and I always love picking your brain, and you just have so much information, so much to offer people in healing themselves from emotional trauma. So thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. It's a real pleasure, and thank you for all the amazing work you do with your interviews and doing such important work that you're doing as well.
Thank you. And everyone, thank you so much for listening to the Supercharged podcast. You can watch this video on getsupercharged.com and, listen and watch other, videos and podcasts that we have on there. So excited to be starting this podcast and finally been doing it. It's been in the works for a while. And with my co-host, Harry Massey, who's the CEO of netshealth.com. Thank you so much for listening, and please leave us a review on iTunes if you've liked what you heard today. We'd appreciate it so, so much. Have a wonderful, energetic day.